Come on, what is up, Substance? Make some noise wherever you are at. I want to welcome everybody joining us in downtown or wherever you're checking this out online. We are going to have some fun today in church. Some of you aren't excited yet, but we're going to get you there. And once again, I'm Pastor Peter, and we are actually in week 2 of a teaching series called Things Above, and we're unpacking all things related to heaven and the afterlife. We're really talking about the doctrines of heaven. And of course, this last week, in case you missed it, we started a general overview. And really, my whole goal is just to get you stoked up a little bit. I want to get you guys excited about the future. And yet, I also realized that there's a lot of people, even after last week, people kept coming up to me like, Peter, really, okay? Like, you know, a lot of Christians, they're still hesitant about it because, you know, it just feels like sometimes, you know, there's this gnawing question, I think, that is at the heart of every one of us, and maybe not every one of us, but for a lot of us, where we struggle with this whole thing of, I believe in heaven, but really, do we really believe in it? I think sometimes it's easy to ask this question, like, are you sure this isn't all there is, this life? Are you sure there's this thing called an afterlife? I mean, come on, let's be honest. It's kind of hard to peer through death's door, right? It's kind of hard to ask some of those deeper questions. How can we really know? And you know, especially when there's literally over 1 billion people on planet Earth who believe that when you die, that's it. There's no more life. That's it. Anything else is just well-wishing. It's just the way you cope with death. It's just the way you cope with these deeper questions in life. And I realize that, you know, if we ask these questions, it can be kind of disturbing and unsettling for some. But I believe that by asking these questions, that's where true faith is found. Faith is not found by living in denial of your doubts. It's found by exploring your doubts. In fact, that's why as your pastor, I always want to ask the tough questions with you, because I believe that if you would actually be willing to explore some of those doubts, you're going to find some of the greatest faith ever. And interestingly, medical science is offering more and more clues that don't deny the actual biblical worldview, but actually confirm the biblical worldview. In fact, modern science, many of you guys know, it's really undergoing a radical shift right now, because one of kind of the interesting things about modern medicine is that modern medicine has enabled us to manipulate the human body in ways that no other generation has ever been able to do, and it's resulting in some really strange stuff, okay? So between life support systems and even like modern resuscitation techniques, the advances have really kind of enabled millions of people to walk through death's door only to kind of get yanked back through, right? They got resuscitated after, you know, medical death, or at least what we previously defined medical death as. They've been able to cross that threshold and then come back to talk about it. In fact, research has now shown that there are over 13 million Americans who have had a near-death experience, who have actually been considered medically dead, and yet were resuscitated to be able to talk about it. And I'm talking about 13 million Americans who have had some sort of out-of-body, life-after-death experience that they can describe in vivid detail. That's more than 4% of the population. And what's been interesting about it is that for years, a lot of people were scared to talk about these things because they would just get mocked and ridiculed. People would be like, yeah, you're just had a weird dream. Your brain concocted a weird thing while you were going through this traumatic experience, and it's normal for people with trauma to make up things. And, you know, people would just condescend upon this topic for so long that a lot of people were like, I'm not even going to say a word about my experience because you're just going to mock me. Well, what happened was, you know, there was one guy who actually was taking it serious. He studied over 1,300 people who had near-death experiences, all of whom had a heavenly visitation of some sort. And he thought, you know what, let's really study this. How many of you saw a light at the end of the tunnel? You know, like proverbial, like describe it. How many of you saw a light at the end of the tunnel? How many of you describe what happened to you? And he found that a whopping 95% of the people who had this heavenly experience were greeted by a dead relative. And he thought it was almost weird. Like, why would so many people have such a consistent experience? Because you would think that, if these were just creative hallucinations, you'd expect way more diversity. You would not have 95% all having a common experience. You'd expect some people would have this experience where, I was riding purple dragons. Other people would be like, I was the purple dragon. Other people, if you were Muslim, you'd have an encounter with Muhammad. If you were a Buddhist, you'd have encounters with, your dead ancestors. If you were, like you'd expect way more diversity, but in reality, it wasn't diverse at all. In fact, the vast majority of these people were having very, very consistent experiences, and he kept thinking, listen, hey, if you could have consistency in an experience, maybe there's scientific principles we can start ascertaining from this. Maybe if researchers started taking near-death experiences more seriously, maybe we could actually find out something real. Maybe we could find out something predictable. And in fact, because at the very least, the evidence was begging researchers with these questions. Why are there so many people that are having these experiences? Why are these experiences so consistent cross-culturally? And as a result of these encounters, believe it or not, there has now been, just in the last really 2 decades, over 900 scholarly articles have been published researching this in peer-reviewed medical journals, prestigious medical journals that wouldn't just risk their reputation on mysticism, right? And so these are scholarly articles, and guess what? Today, you're going to be so glad you came to church because we're actually going to explore some of these, okay? I've been reading through just a boatload of these over the last 6 months, and I've been finding some crazy stuff that the more you read it, it doesn't deny the biblical account. I actually believe it can confirm the biblical account, and so we are going to have so much fun. Are you guys ready for this? Some of you are like, I don't know if I'm ready for this. It's okay, it's okay. Okay, now, Christians, we've always believed in out-of-body experiences because it's what the Bible teaches, that when we die, our spirits will go to paradise, we'll actually live with Christ, and then when Christ returns, there's going to be something called the resurrection of the dead, where our spirits will be reunited with our bodies, and then we're going to live on a new heaven and a new earth, okay? So we've always believed in this. We've always believed that if you were to summarize what a human being is, according to 1 Thessalonians 5:23, that we're a 3-part being. You are a spirit who has a soul and you live in a body, okay? A 3-part being, and sometimes your spirit can be separated from that body. And in fact, the Apostle Paul even implies in 2 Corinthians 12, he actually describes that he had this like heavenly encounter where God brought him to the 3rd heaven, and that he doesn't know if he was in his body or out of his body, but so the Apostle Paul was implying that it may even be possible that our spirits can separate from the body. We don't actually fully know because Scripture is not very definitive about it, but we do believe that there is a 3-part being, that you're not just a body, that you're not just a brain. There is that our consciousness exists in some sort of multi-layered reality that is more than maybe just what medical science describes. And of course, so Christians, this isn't a new thing for us, but when it came to out-of-body experiences, I think that when it came to medical researchers, they're like, yeah, I don't know, that just sounds like mysticism. But again, with all of these near-death experiences that we can now study, it actually said, well, okay, why don't we actually research these and see if there are certain examples where we could actually verify medically that these people did in fact have an experience outside of their body. Let's think about this from a scientific standpoint and see if we can kind of test this, if we can really experiment with this. Well, as an example, okay, there's a huge number of people who've actually come into the hospital either in a coma or dead on arrival, medically speaking. Their heart wasn't working or they were brain dead, and yet there's enough people who claim to be floating above their bodies when they were in this state that is verifiably dead, right? And of course, again, in most cases, rational people would say, well, you were just hallucinating and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's so many examples of people where they describe not only medical procedures, but exact conversations that the doctors were having about their bodies while they were verifiably in a coma or verifiably even brain dead. Okay, so now just let me give you an example of this. There was a skeptical cardiologist named Dr. Michael Sabin, who kept hearing these stories over and over and over and over again. And again, he just thought, okay, it's just a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of, but he thought, okay, might as well study it. It's actually very fascinating stuff to start studying this, because he had resuscitated all sorts of people over his years as a doctor. And yet what surprised him was the fact that many of these people would accurately describe the conversations that the doctors would have. Or let me give you an example. One guy who claimed to be floating above his own body during surgery, he noticed that the doctor who was doing this heart surgery was wearing white patent leather shoes. And while he was floating over his body watching this surgery, he just kept thinking, why would a doctor be wearing these shoes while doing this bloody surgery? I mean, blood's all over the place, squirting all over the place. And he kept thinking, why? And then why am I focusing on this doctor's shoes while I'm seeing my body? There's more important things to be focusing on. And yet he just could not believe that the doctor would not be wearing, some sort of splats or scuffs to protect his shoes from the blood. It just literally didn't make sense. And of course, he even told the doctor after the surgery, why in the world were you wearing those shoes? And he's like, how did you know I was wearing these shoes? And he's like, well, you're never going to believe it. I literally was floating above my body. Now, so, you could say, okay, that's a crazy story. There was another person who came into the hospital in a coma, and he was getting CPR, and they needed to pull his dentures out in order to intubate, to put a breathing tube in. And of course, this one particular nurse was really kind of reefing on his dentures really hard. And the patient claimed that he was floating over his body in horror of how this woman was trying to remove his dentures. You're going to literally break me. You know what I mean? The way you're doing it is horrible. And then finally he noticed that she lodged the dentures out and that she pulled them and put them into this sliding door, a drawer in a rolling cabinet that was covered with bottles. It was a very specific place. And of course, he's floating over his body thinking, there's no way people are going to find my dentures when all this is over. They're going to be in that drawer, and that drawer is going to roll off to somebody, because they kept having to move his body around. And, he's thinking this thought while watching this happen. Well, of course, sure enough, a week later, he wakes up out of his coma, and of course, they couldn't find the cabinet. They couldn't find his dentures. But then all of a sudden, the nurse who had worked on him walked through, and he goes, hey, you, come in here. You're the nurse who removed my dentures, I know. And she's like, how would you know that? This is the first time we've ever met when you're conscious. And he's like, well, I saw you actually pull them out, and then you took them and you put them in that one sliding drawer in that rolling thing with all the bottles on it. And she was totally shocked, oh my gosh, how would you know that you were in a coma? There's no way you could have known that, right? So in the specific place, and sure enough, that's where the dentures were, and he got them back, and he was happy. You know what I mean? So this Dr. Sabin just kept hearing stories like this that would just kind of pique his curiosity. Well, then he heard another story. There was a woman named Maria who came into the hospital after a severe heart attack. And of course, like the others, she claimed to be floating over her body. And yet what was interesting about hers is that she described the exact order in which they resuscitated her, which was very, very specific. And he was almost a little shocked by how detailed she was able to give the resuscitation procedure, because it was a little too specific. You know what I'm saying? How could she have known that other than actually being there or having medical training? Well, she said something that was just over the top unique. She said not only did she start floating up out of her body during the procedure, but she said, I actually started floating up out of the hospital. And it was actually quite odd. She literally started floating outside up out of the hospital, and she was floating about over the third story of the hospital. And all of a sudden, she noticed the weirdest thing on the third story of this hospital. She saw this shoe sitting in a windowsill. And she thought, that's really odd. Why would there be a shoe in the windowsill? And so she kind of floated up over to this shoe, and she's like looking at this shoe on the window ledge, thinking, who in the world would just put a singular shoe on the windowsill? And it was a dark blue shoe. I mean, she could describe it in very great detail. It was a men's shoe that was dark blue, and it was for the left foot. She could see it was a left-footed shoe, and so she's looking at it, and she noticed there was a little scuff. There was a little like mark over the little toe, and then the shoelace was tucked under the heel of this shoe, and she thought, how weird is that? And then all of a sudden, she's like, how weird is it that I'm focusing on a shoe in the midst of this experience, and that, there's probably more important things that she should be focusing on. Well, all of a sudden, she felt her body, she felt like she got zapped back into her body, and she was resuscitated. And of course, she was recounting the full story to somebody afterwards, thinking it's really a weird story. You know what I'm saying? Other people have these like really cool heaven stories, and I've got this story of, who did you meet when you were floating? I met a shoe, a left-footed men's shoe with a scuff over the little toe. Well, a researcher was listening to all of her details and started thinking, gosh, you know what? A lot of the things that you were sharing in your story are actually verifiable. Meaning I can actually go around the hospital and verify, was this in fact the exact order of the procedure? And even more important than that, is there in fact a left-footed men's shoe on the windowsill of the third story of this hospital? Things like that. And so, sure enough, the researcher went around and started looking around in this hospital thinking, can I verify all these? Interviewed all the doctors and verified the procedure, the order of the procedure, and went on a search for a shoe and literally went from department to department on the third floor of looking for, hey, can I just look around for a second, in places where people can't even necessarily go without security clearance, and looking, windowsill to windowsill. Sure enough, found the exact shoe, a man's left-footed dark blue shoe with the shoelace tucked under the heel, and thought, what are the odds? What are the odds? I mean, there's no way you could have seen that shoe from the outside of the hospital. There's no way you could have just walked around the hospital and seen it. It's not like somebody would be randomly walking around talking about their left-footed blue shoe with the scuff over the little toe with the shoelace tucked under the heel. And what natural way could you have verified that actually existed? And maybe you're out there and you're like skeptical, and I get it, and you're like, Pastor Peter, well, that's not incontrovertible. I mean, at the very least, let me just say this. It's interesting, right? It's interesting. So a couple years back, here's kind of an interesting story for you. So my wife and I bought a new house, and of course, every day when I drive home, I get to pass by this gorgeous lake with a small marsh off to the side. And this is kind of one of my favorite stories. And right in the middle of this marsh was this gorgeous blue heron bird. And I don't know if you've ever seen a blue heron before, but they're huge, okay? It was like almost 4 feet tall. I mean, it was like it was so tall. It was like a giant bird. It was, maybe it's just me, but I'm not used to seeing birds that big. It was like maybe what I imagine an ostrich would be. It was huge. It was like bigger than any goose. And immediately I did the dad thing where I immediately started shouting, kids, put down your phones. Look at the great blue heron. I did the dad thing. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, just look at that amazing bird. That looks like a blue heron. And I start telling them all the facts that they don't want to hear. And both of my teenage daughters started laughing at me. And I'm like, what? I thought they were laughing because oh no, Dad, you just turned into a dad. You know what I'm saying? This is that moment. And they're like, Dad, that's not even a real bird. It's a lawn ornament. And they both started laughing. And at the time, I needed glasses, but I didn't know it. You know what I'm saying? And I went in to get my eyes checked, and sure enough, they're like, how did you live this long without glasses? But sure enough, I'm squinting and I'm staring at this thing, and it was completely frozen for like 60 seconds straight. And then, and I'm like, wow. I guess it is a lawn ornament. And, of course, both my girls were like, Dad, you're such a dork. And then we drove away, right? So, and day after day after day, I would drive by that marsh, and again, just looking at that fake blue heron, still staring in the exact same direction. And like I think every day that I saw that blue heron, I just kept thinking to myself, I cannot believe I ever thought that thing was real. I mean, because every single day I would pass by it, honestly, I started to see just how fake it was. It was, it was clearly made out of plastic. I mean, it wasn't even the longer I looked at it, it didn't even look like a good fake blue heron. You know what I'm saying? Not that I'm a fake blue heron expert, but I'm just saying, it doesn't even look real. I mean, honestly, I kept thinking it's way too large and the colors don't even look right. And, here's the truth, okay? I wanted to believe it was real. I wanted to believe that my new house is in the middle of Minnesota paradise and there's great Minnesotan waterfowl just waiting for me to enjoy it and point out to my kids. You know what I'm saying? I wanted to believe that. And I think in a similar way, I think there's a lot of people who kind of take the same approach to the afterlife. I mean, yeah, I want to believe in heaven. I want to believe there's something more than this life. I want to believe that this entire crazy world just did not spontaneously arrive out of nothing and here we are. I mean, I want to make sense of it, but I mean, come on. I just think a lot of these claims, maybe they're just like a fancy lawn ornament. It's a fake blue heron that people just like to share these stories so that we can all feel like life has some meaning. You know what I mean? Well, that's exactly what this skeptical cardiologist, Dr. Sabom, thought as he dove into the research, and yet he just kept hearing story after story of these out-of-body folks that was just too accurate to the medical procedure. He kept thinking, how can people with zero medical training, they're not related to anybody medical, how can these people so accurately describe the procedures to the degree that they are unless they actually had some sort of real out-of-body experience? It felt too accurate. Because for example, there was a patient by the name of Pete Morton who described the medical procedures with such detail and such accuracy that Dr. Sabom even thought, man, that description would be good enough to actually teach other doctors how to do it. I mean, I could literally do training using his non-trained observations from his out-of-body experience. And Pete, who claimed to be hovering over his body, he even described the exact way in which the doctor whacked his heart, and it was weird to him. He actually described how he wrote, the doctor struck me, and I mean, he really whacked me, to the point of I was disturbed watching him work on me. The doctor pulled his fist way back behind his head and he hit me right in the center of my chest. And then he pulled out a big needle and he described it like one of those like some sort of weird Amazonian, removing someone's heart's procedure. And, he was describing this in all of its gory details. He pulled out a big needle, plunged it into my chest, and Pete even remembered the exact voltage amount that they used to zap him, and he thought to himself, that is way too much. That's gonna kill me. You know what I'm saying? Because he's watching this kind of in horror, what are you guys doing? And then he described it in such accuracy that even the doctors were like, there's no way you could, if you were in an unconscious state, or even if you were partially awake, you wouldn't know the voltage level that we used in all of that. And so even still, though, okay, so Dr. Sabom is thinking, okay, what if these people somehow had a medical awareness that they weren't even aware that they had, and somehow in their unconscious mind, it assembled all this information? What if they happen to read it and they don't remember it consciously, but their subconscious does? What if they happen to watch a documentary on this procedure and you just watched a lot of hospital TV dramas, you know what I'm saying? And eventually over time, your subconscious mind can assemble a startlingly accurate guess, okay? So a lot of researchers started, they would pose this as the good guess hypothesis. That's how they explained it. And the good guess hypothesis is this idea that our subconscious minds are collecting a lot more information than we realize and just assembled it at some point throughout their medical journey. Well, some of the near-death experience people thought, well, let's verify this. Let's do an experiment on this good guess hypothesis. And so in their experiment, what they did is they gathered all sorts of people who had had near-death experiences. However, what they did is they created this one subcategory of NDEers, near-death experience people, people who were out like a light the entire time. You know what I mean? Like people who don't remember anything about their entire experience. It was only after the fact that people were like, yeah, you basically died, okay? People like that. Okay, so the researchers actually sat that group down and they said, okay, we want you to make up a fake story of what it would sound like if you did float over your body. In other words, we want you to produce a fake story of you hovering over your body, and in this fake story, we want you to describe with as much detail as possible what the procedure looked like, what the sequence is, what the conversations were between the doctors and the nurses, and all of these types of things. We want you to get really, really detailed with this. And so, sure enough, they wrote down all of their fake stories. And then what the researchers did is they wanted to compare all of the fake stories to the real stories. They wanted to see what are the differences in the way that they describe the procedures, the conversations, and everything. And they thought that surely that they're all going to be fairly close, okay? They thought, they're going to be very similar in order to, support the good guess hypothesis. And what was interesting is they actually found that the fake stories were wildly inaccurate next to the real stories, okay? They found that all of the fake accounts had massive errors with the procedures and the equipment. For example, many people, imagined that the doctors used a defibrillator that when it wasn't used. In fact, 28 patients out of that one group of the fakers, they couldn't even fake guess with any level of accuracy whatsoever, and yet the out-of-body folks were wildly accurate. In fact, what was so bizarre was they actually determined a statistical accuracy of all of their descriptions. They took a pool of the real stories and they pooled them, all of the stories in which they had verifiable details, like the denture person or like the shoe person, okay? They collected only stories that had verifiable details where they could actually interview people. Doctor, did you in fact say this exact expression to the nurse 3/4 of the way through the surgery? Like, did you say that? Yes or no? And they went through and they took all of the verifiable details. Get this, okay? So J.M. Holden, a professor of psychology, did this experiment on 93 NDEers who had this experience. And he specifically found that 92% of the verifiable details were completely accurate. 6% were partially accurate. In other words, there was some error, 6%, but only 1% of the details they gave were actually completely false. Okay, so in other words, they were 92 to 99% accurate. There was really only about a 1% of degree that they were off in terms of their details. Think about that. And he was stunned by how accurate their descriptions were. For a person who's going through a heart attack or who's almost brain dead or whose heart isn't working, you know what? I wouldn't suspect that their memory would be accurate to the tune of 99%. Heck, I can't even remember what sermon I preached last week. I'm just saying. I don't know how people would have an accurate memory in the midst of trauma like that. And maybe you're out there and you're like, yeah, but Pastor Peter, I mean, what if? Just what if? Okay, let me just be skeptical for a second. What if these people's brains were still active even though they were in a comatose state? What if their brains were still absorbing information through their hearing even though their visual wasn't, fully active? Or what about, it's interesting studying the near-death experiences of blind people who had visual experiences, even though they were, born with blindness, right? So, what if the drugs were able to make up these encounters with God and they didn't actually have that encounter when they were out? You know what I mean? Like maybe it was like afterwards, or in their brain just kind of blurred when it happened. Okay, perhaps, okay? Those skepticisms might be true, but you know what? What's interesting is there's also been cases like this where the patient was verifiably brain dead at the exact moment in which they had their most lucid memories. And if I could share this one last medical story. A while back, I read the story of Dr. Eben Alexander. He's an academic neurosurgeon at the Harvard Medical School. Well, what's interesting in this particular case is this academic neurosurgeon was also the victim who had the experience. So he ended up contracting a rare case of E. coli bacterial meningitis, which of course, if you don't know, it's a lethal infection that destroys your brain, particularly the outer portions of the brain, where our creativity and dreaming and fantasy a lot of times happens. And of course, by the time the doctors actually caught this infection and were able to put him on antibiotics, he was already as good as dead. In fact, he was already having seizures, which if you're a doctor, you know that a person with that particular disease having seizures, they already only have a 10% chance of survival. And even if they survive, they tend to be vegetables because the E. coli has already eaten away such large portions of their brain. And of course, in his case, it was even worse because he went into a coma for around 6 days. And of course, the odds of survival statistically, to be specific, is only about 3%. And of the people that wake up from that meningitis, the 3% that do wake up after a coma for 6 days, again, they're almost all vegetables, so to speak. And here's the crazy part. While he was virtually brain dead on a ventilator, he had an extremely vivid out-of-body experience where he had a detailed encounter with God. And when all this heavenly experience was over, against all odds, he suddenly woke up from his coma around the very moment when doctors were about to unplug him because there's simply no hope. And what was interesting about his case is not the fact that he just woke up from a coma that nobody wakes up from. And not only did he wake up, but his brain capacity was still intact, to everybody's amazement. But what was so unique about his case is for years, skeptics of near-death experiences would say that all of these out-of-body experiences were merely fantasies created by the brain, and yet what made Dr. Eben Alexander's case so fascinating was the fact that due to his meningitis, there is simply no way his brain could have created such a fantasy because not only was his neocortex completely non-functioning, but he also had all of the brain scans and the neurological data to prove that his brain was not functioning. And he even had the ability to look at it and verify the exact moments. And keep in mind, what made this unique was the victim was also a skeptical academic neurosurgeon. And he certainly wasn't going to just tell people about his experience, I met God, because he knew full well people would think he was crazy. Why? Because he told people that they were crazy himself throughout his experience. And so what he did was he decided, I'm not going to rest until I work through every plausible theory for my experience other than I met God. And guess what? So he recruited numerous neurosurgeons and scientists to help him think up as many skeptical theories as possible that might prove his God encounter was all fake, was just a hallucination. And of course, if you're really nerdy and you want to read it, he wrote a book called Proof of Heaven where he medically debunks every single one of these theories that he and his scientific friends could come up with. In his book, Proof of Heaven, Dr. Alexander finally wrote, what really mattered about my case was not what happened to me personally. It wasn't, I had this amazingly vivid experience of meeting God. What mattered about my case was not what happened to me personally, but the sheer, flat-out impossibility of arguing from a medical standpoint that it was all fantasy. And why? because his brain was completely incapable of fantasy, let alone basic functioning. And here's the deal, church. I'm not trying to say that this evidence reveals beyond all reasonable doubt any reason to be skeptical, okay? I'm not trying to say leave your brain at the door. I'm trying to simply say that at the very least, there is more than enough evidence to suggest that there is some sort of conscious existence after medical death that has nothing to do with the brain. All I'm trying to say is, what if it's true? What if it's true? What if the Bible was true all along and that you are a spirit who has a soul, you live in a body, and there is something more than the current experience that medical science might define for us? You know, coming back to the fake blue heron by my house, after 2 weeks of driving by that thing, I was just almost angry. I was like, I don't know why. I just made a fool out of myself in front of my girls, and I was going on a walk down by the marsh where the fake blue heron was. I was just exercising, and I suddenly looked at the plastic bird, and I looked at it for a while, and I'm like, I can't even believe I ever thought that was real. And I picked up a stone, and I just whipped it at I thought maybe I can hit it. I want to see how good my throwing arm is still, you know what I'm saying? And so I took it and I whipped it. And of course, I was pretty close, right? I was only a couple feet away from the bird. All of a sudden, it turned its head and it flew away. The fake blue heron was real all along, people. Apparently it really loves to look in one direction, okay? That's what I figured out. And the other thing is, fathers do know best, daughters. Fathers do know best. I'm just saying, it was real all along. And now I'm even more mad. Now I'm like feeling stupid all over again because I almost killed a great blue heron with a rock, okay? And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so glad my throwing arm is not what it used to be. But listen, hey, church, I realized something very profound that day, and it was this. The mere suggestion from somebody in my life that it was fake sent me reeling for days. It amazed me how a small seed of doubt could germinate in my soul to the point where I actually denied reality. I saw fakeness where beauty actually existed. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to belief in the afterlife, when it comes to belief in God. And I want to encourage you, the moral of the story is sometimes you just got to chuck a rock. You know what I'm saying? You have to test it out. You have to explore it. So many people are afraid to be skeptical about the things of God because they think that it's sacrilegious and it's just going to make people mad. And we live in a culture of where everybody is offended and everybody has false outrage of everything nowadays. How dare you suggest that I'm You know what I mean? It's like every night on the news, people just act in false outrage. And it's getting to the point where nobody can even have an intellectual conversation anymore. I think the same thing happens in churches, and I want you to know, I want Substance to be a safe place where you can explore your doubts, because ultimately, I believe that true faith can only be found when you explore doubts. And that's why we do programs like Alpha here. And again, just check it out in our downtown campus. Monday we're going to do it. We're going to kick this off. It's just a place where people can ask those deeper questions without feeling weird about it. It's like we want to celebrate skepticism. And it's kind of one last story, and I'll land the plane here, is I'll never forget, I heard a true story about a 12-year-old girl who was actually told by the same neurosurgeon I just mentioned. Yet this 12-year-old girl was teetering towards death, and the doctors finally brought her back, and later on, after she could talk freely again, she started sharing about her crazy experience, and she was like, you'll never believe it. I literally had this encounter where I literally went to heaven. And she said it was this landscape that was incredibly beautiful, and it was filled with love, and it was so vivid. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I woke up from a dream and it was all kind of abstract in my mind. I can remember every last detail of it with exquisite detail. And of course, what was weird about it is this guy greeted me who claimed to be my brother. And he actually encouraged me, and he kind of gave me a little tour, and she said it felt incredible. It felt so real. The only problem was she didn't have a brother. So how could it be real? I mean, she didn't have a brother. And so it had to have been a hallucination. And so she's just kind of telling all of this to her dad. And of course, her dad, he was kind of, he looked stunned. And the reason why he was stunned is because she did have a brother, In fact, she had an older brother who died 3 months before she was born, and it was so traumatic for the parents that they just never told her about it. They never said there wasn't a time to be telling this little girl, hey, yeah, you had a brother. Her parents had just never mentioned it until that moment, and they all kind of marveled, like, wow, what if it's true? And really, that's all I'm asking today is, what if it's true? There's just so much evidence out there that would, even if it's 1% chance, you owe it to yourself to pursue this. And if I could just finish with this last scripture. Many of you might remember in John's Gospel, John 14:1, Jesus was speaking about heaven. He was speaking about the future when he said, John 14:1, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, but believe also in me. And then he goes on to talk about heaven, and he says, verse 2, there's more than enough room in my Father's house. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to go prepare a place for you? I mean, the answer obviously being no. And remember, he's comforting his disciples because he knows that he's about to die, and he knows that when someone close to you dies and you realize how fragile life is, it forces you to ask deeper questions. He knows that his disciples are going to be asking deeper questions. He knew that death is a door that is difficult to peer through, and so finally he says in verse 3, when everything is ready, okay, he's letting them know, I'm going to die, I'm going to go prepare a place for you, but listen, when everything is ready, I will come and get you so that you will always be with me where I am at. In other words, no matter what you are about to experience, no matter how crazy things get, when you see me die, when you see me rise from the dead, I don't want you to get all caught up in all of the questions and miss the fact that I am who I say I am and that I am preparing a place for you. You see, church, that's God's ultimate desires. He just wants us to do life with him, and yet he's not gonna push his way in. He just wants to pose the question, will you see this evidence as worthy of being sought out? And that's what church is. If you're looking for a place where you can come and just explore the things of God with me, then listen, Substance is going to be a safe place, because ultimately this is a church where we want to explore those things that we might really wrestle with the truths of God in a way that's powerful, in a way that's helpful. And if you're here today and you're like, you know what, that's what I'm looking for, then I just want to say welcome to our family. This crazy, unique family of people that come from a diversity of experiences. And I ultimately believe that many of you guys are going to make the decision to really pursue God on a higher level. And listen, some of you might even be here today, and that's you. You're like, you know what? You're like, wow, I've never even been in a place that would explore God like this. And here's what I'm going to do is I'm just going to end with a short little moment of prayer. And if you are even remotely open to God, I want you to take whatever little bit of faith you got, even if it's a very, very small amount. And I just want you to put it in God. And when you do this, I'm just telling you, I believe that God is going to show up in ways that you never thought possible, because this is a God who loves to reveal himself. And so would you be open to do that right now? The moment I pray, we're just all going to bow our heads, close our eyes. And if you're ready to take that step closer to God, I want you to take out your phone and text the word substance to 31996. The number is going to be up on the screen. Text the word substance to the number 31996. It's just an act of faith. And I really believe that God is going to look down from heaven and he's going to be like, okay, that person's serious. All right, if you're serious, I'm going to show you all sorts of evidence that'll meet your intellectual needs, okay? God cares about your intellectual needs. And so if that's you, let's just bow our heads right now. Let's pray. And let's just make this serious between ourselves and God. God, you see every single person in this room. You see where we're at. You see what we're struggling with. You see our doubts. And God, you actually celebrate those doubts. And I just pray that Lord, you said, seek and we will find. And I pray that would be true over every single person praying a sincere prayer right here and right now. Meet us where we're at and enable us to live the life that you promised all throughout your scripture, life to the fullest. And church, if that's your prayer, just repeat this after me. Say, dear Jesus, forgive me of my sin, starting today. In Jesus' name I pray. If you agree with that prayer, say amen. 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 With all that said, we're going to have our campus pastors coming up here and tell us where we're going to go next. Love you guys. We'll see you next week.